Namaste everyone. Warm greetings from Team with Embryo. Amid a political and scholarly discourse which is filled with self-loathing, a truly valuable asset articulating the positions of the Indic civilization, and a frontline intellectual reclaiming the narrative, we are thrilled to have Mr. J. Sai Deepak, an engineer turned litigator, practicing as an arguing counsel before the Supreme Court of India and the High Court of Delhi with us for this session. He is also the author of India, that is Bharat, Coloniality, Civilization and Constitution. The theme of today's discussion is Indic Revivalism, viewing modern India through an Indic lens.
Quite interestingly, today is the first day of the Vikram Samvat calendar, which is celebrated as the Nav Samvatsar or the Hindu New Year, and there cannot be a better day for a civilizational revivalist discourse than this. So I begin with the fundamental question. How would you define an Indic state? How would you define Hindutva? And does the latter seek to establish the former?
So perhaps in an Indic state I would have actually avoided using the word model in the title. Anybody who's actually read the book so far would have pointed out this is the first mistake of the title itself. So what's the title you've given? Yes, exactly. So first of all, I would have replaced India with Bharat, and I would have not used the word model at all under any circumstances. Because the one thing that I very clearly said is that it has its own history, and it's not just a term that you use casually. So, repeat the question, and then you're trying to break it into parts and layers.
Yeah, so the first question is how would you define an Indic state? And the second is how would you define Hindutva?
So, the first question is more prescriptive and requires further homework. So, I'll come to that second. As far as Hindutva is concerned, I think I've said this in more than one, let's say, debate, which is that Thwa translates to ness in English. So, Hindutva is not necessarily an invention or a political invention. It simply translates to Hinduness and therefore the essence of being a Hindu. Now, the question is slightly more complex because when do you have to define the self? Assume for a moment that you happen to be, or if you were a fully Hindu state, which is to say that there is not the existence of a single non-Hindu faith in this country, then you wouldn't need to define the self because there is no relative framework being applied. When there are people who do not subscribe to this particular, let's say, way of life or dharma for that matter, that's when the definition of the self becomes important. But in the peculiar history of Bharat, given the kind of successive waves of colonization that it has witnessed and experienced, it has no other option but to define itself. Because its identity stands otherized by other religions for that matter, or other faith systems for that matter. So if you don't define yourself, you do not have a specific identity around which you can rally. Human psychology requires a specific form of an identity which is relatable and proximal, which makes it possible for you to coalesce either as a community or a network. So Hindutva is largely, and I wouldn't say this negatively, is reactionary in nature because its existence has been triggered and necessitated by the need for survival. So you can call this as a resistive identity as opposed to calling it a reactionary identity, because reactionary obviously has negative connotations. So it's a resistive identity which is necessary. So the question would be, what is the shelf life of this identity? When does it become irrelevant? When does it die? When does it become obsolete? The answer is when the threat ceases to exist. And if according to you, well, they will never cease to exist, then this cannot cease to exist. It has to continue. There's no other option. Now going to the second part of your question, which is, how do you define an Indic state? I don't believe I have the answer to that question because the research from my end is not complete. I have a very tentative definitional response, but I don't have a specific nuts and bolts, let's say, prescriptive response. And I hope to have some kind of a response to that question by the time I'm done with art religion. That's exactly why I started working on it. Because there's a lot of talk going on multiple public platforms, but if the pen has to meet the paper, do you have the clarity to come out with a very specific position, because that's where the true test is. If you don't have it, the rest of it is, if I were to put it in very civil terms, you would call it BS, I would call it bovine thesis. That's it. Next.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yes.
Sir, so you've
I just
established.
have one suggestion. Apart from asking your questions, it's okay to actually open it up to the rest of the audience and intersperse it. I don't have a problem with that.
Sure,
Because I don't want them to get the impression that this is a scripted session.
Yeah, sure. Like we'll open session. We'll open the session to.
Okay, please go on.
So, sir, you said that Hindutva is a resistive identity,
Yes.
and it will cease to exist when the threat of organized action against the Hindu identity will cease to exist.
Okay.
But to that, my question would be: do you think that the current orientation of Hindutva has shifted from a civilizational battle to like a civilizational battle for Indic revivalism to mere democratic politics, and it has harmed the Hindu cause?
So you see, it's easy to get idealistic about this, where you believe that politics is crude, politics is dirty, and it lacks the ability to encompass nuance. But that is the nature of politics across the world, and at least democratic politics. Because if you're looking at democratic politics, what are you looking at essentially? An approximation of multiple forms of opinion, then trying to come up with some public position. And in a democracy, even if I sound elitist, I don't think that while everybody may have the right to have an opinion, the quality of opinions are not the same. That is a fact. So by the time it reaches the level of politics and the level of public projection, the purity of that particular concept is necessarily lost, or at least it's diluted to a significant extent. So the only way that you can perhaps offset that dilution is by ensuring that the society's moorings are strong. So assume for a moment that you think of, I'm sure students of telecommunication know this, what do you call this? Transmission loss, right? Lossy transmission. So by the time let's say that idea is escalated from the level of the society to the political stage, or the political plane, I would say at least 25% of its purity is gone. Okay? So therefore you have to offset it by ensuring that your traditional institutions, so to speak, and your familial institutions for that matter, retain that mooring and still continue to project it. You need the other side as well. Let's be very realistic. While people like me and others have been speaking on this particular subject even before 2014, because we're all products of the earlier era, of the Bajpayee era, so to speak, and all that, and therefore there is a certain degree of knowledge and awareness even before 2014. But the strength of 2014 and 2019 is perhaps the reason why so many people have come out openly, who were otherwise the fence sitters or the silent majority for that matter. So don't underestimate it. But the caveat which I've always placed is that do not surrender the society's right and discussion on this entirely at the altar of politics. Because then you're giving it complete space, and that's a forum for wheeling, dealing, fixing and setting. Okay? That's not exactly an idealistic place. Right? So when you do that, a civilizational incentive will become subject to multiple political interests, which is what you should be guarding against. But you need to be in a position to use that as an instrument to get the job done. So don't be too idealistic in the sense of the strategy. As far as the goals are concerned, you can retain your ideas. You should perhaps retain your ideas.
Yeah, as you said, using it as a tool for the civilizational agenda.
Correct.
So we do not negate the fact that it is being used, or it is a very significant tool.
Correct.
But at the same time, we were more into asking as to from where we stand right now, from where you see the modern trend of Hindutva politics. Do you think that the tool part is over? It's not really being exercised for civilizational interests, and political interests are overpowering that aspect.
That is not a problem of Hindutva politics, that is a problem with the current format of democracy itself. Which is to say, as long as you subscribe to the current form of democracy, you will always have Rajniti but not Rajdharma. Which is to say, it effectively is a matter of politics. And therefore, the politician will need to find an incentive which translates to electoral success. Okay? That's the name of the game. You can't blame him. Okay, let's put it this way. According to you, even the Western institutions in this country, is this the most ideal education system that you've been put through? No. But does it mean that you're stupid? No. That's a function of the system, isn't it? That is a function of the system. You choose to run in a rat race because the system is designed for a rat race. You choose to cram or you choose to prepare for an entrance examination as opposed to focusing on the subject because that is the nature of the game. Otherwise, you get left out of the race, period. Right? Now, it doesn't matter whether you know the subject or not. The only thing that matters ultimately are your achievements on paper. It's even worse with political spectrum. So, ask yourself if the expectation of purity that you have from the political system, do you have it in the education system? If the answer is a no, then I would say that you're actually applying higher standards to a much more dirtier thing. Right? So, considering that, my answer would be that in the long run, thanks to the churn that's happening across the world, with states like Russia, with states like China, and hopefully Bharat emerging in the future, civilizational statism or statehood will gradually change and mold the definition of democracy itself. Because you will realize at some point that this is not the best, let's say, template possible. Now, the moment I made this suggestion, I'm going to be accused of both fascism and anti-democratic tendencies. Right? It is okay, I don't care. It is not matter. The point is, you're talking of theory, you're talking of possibilities, and you're asking yourself certain questions in the realm of theory. So be open to this. Democracy is barely about 100, 200 years old in the format as it exists. So don't glorify it because then you're telling yourself that the generation that I live in has the best ideas possible. There couldn't be a more stupider proposition for that matter. Okay, that can't be the way it is. Because then you're foreclosing the possibility of the future to evolve. And you're also devaluing the past, which you really know nothing much about. Okay? So both you display your ignorance of the past and the arrogance of the hubris towards the future. Neither of which is justified. So, if you are open to the possibility that democracy can evolve and must evolve, now it must evolve only from where it stands. So, assume for a moment you have 100% franchise today, and all you're looking at is 50% past the post. Anybody who gets the majority, anybody wins. That's it. Now, ultimately, this ability is capable of being turned on its head. You've seen that in the erection of the Mayor of London. You have seen that in multiple Swedish cities or in European cities, and Europe, according to me, the last civilization at this point. And the only bulwark of the Western civilization at this point is the totally differing, wallowing United States under the current establishment. Right? Nobody would have ever assumed that there would come a president who would make Trump look better. Right? So considering that, I genuinely believe that we are in for a huge churn. And this is, if I say so, a discussion or a high table of adults. India has to ask itself whether it wishes to be de-adulted or does it want to subscribe to certain notions which are Nehruvian in nature. And I dare say, fortunately, despite my own criticisms of the government on several fronts, its handling of the Russia-Ukraine crisis has been much better in terms of its ability to display a spine and put forth national interest above anything else. And for the first time, I think people are finally calling out the absolute nonsense called the rules-based international order. There is no such thing as international order. Balance of power and Shakti Santulan is the only name of the game when it comes to international order, so to speak. That you're seeing live in front of you. Who would have assumed that after the Second World War, you can have two instances where you have actual annexations going on in 2022? Tells you what, at the end of the day, whether you want to call it primal, primitive, whatever it is, unfortunately the reality is, in the international sphere, it's Matsya Nyaya that works, which is might is right. If you're in a position to assert yourself either through economy or through the stick, then the way belongs to you, period. Unfortunately, that's the reality. You can be angry at it, you can say, no, this is injustice. And you can get all woke about it, but then that's reality. It doesn't care for your woke sentiments.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, speaking of colonial institutions and the provisions incorporated in them,
Right.
The government control of Hindu temples is one domain which you work substantially. For instance, the Padmanabh Swami temple.
Right.
How significant is the movement of liberation of Hindu temples for Indic revivalism?
So I have a clarification to make, and it's very important that I put out this clarification. I have approached this issue as a practicing lawyer who is also practicing Hindu, not as a campaigner or as an activist. Because if you tend to become an activist, then perhaps you end up losing a sense of objectivity. I'm not saying activism is bad. You need the mad hatters at the end of the day because they are the ones to push the envelope on any subject. But you also need people who understand the system and ask, will this work, will this not work? So I see myself in that particular mold. And having said a lot on the temple freedom issue, I don't wish to talk too much about it, except to the extent of saying that why did I choose this particular cause as part of my pro bono commitments? I think there's a bit of an echo. Is it better now? Yes. Okay. So two reasons is that the way forward for the Hindu community is not secularization or greater secularization. I would call it greater dharmicization. That's the only way forward. And therefore, if you want to do that at a time when families are perhaps not in a position to either become a paucity of time or a paucity of extended family resources, it's time to revive your tried and tested institutions. And if those institutions are under the yoke of a state, which calls itself secular, or is comfortable squatting in a religious institution, that hypocrisy needed to be called out. And so therefore, I feel that a multiplier effect at this point, until a dharmic state comes about, which is not a theocratic state. That's what most people make a mistake when they speak of dharmic state. They assume it's a theocracy, because immediately the mind races to Saudi Arabia and Iran, because then you're subconsciously comparing Hinduism with Islam, which it is not. So therefore, the idea is, until such time, it's important for these institutions to create their traditional roles, which is providing both spiritual service, a religious identity, rooting, and certainly community outreach. I don't see the point in constantly blaming some other institution for running better hospitals and schools. Well, this is something you should be doing. So I'm saying, if this is what seems to impress this generation, look at them, they do this, look at them, they do that, well, you should be asking the right question. Not why aren't they doing it, why are they not able to do it? There's a difference. Because why aren't they doing it is a question of intention. Why are they not able to do it is a question of capacity and capability. That's a different question altogether. So we end up asking the question of intention, but never ask the question of capacity, capability, and limitations. So the idea was to tell them, this is it. Now you answer this question. Because in Delhi there's a culture. Anybody wants to donate money, they go to Gurudwara, not to a temple. मंदिर गंदे होते हैं, मंदिर में पंडित होते हैं, पंडित खाते हैं. This is the standard dialogue that I hear. It's absolutely, it's an abominable statement to hear about. I don't wish to hear these statements at all. Because that reflects a certain mentality which is both ignorant and which is self-loathing, the words that you typically use. So the idea was to try and bring the issue back to the center stage. And whatever little skill sets I have, I thought I should at least try and do that. So I've spoken enough on that particular issue, and I say this publicly. I've taken a conscious decision to keep my mouth shut on the subject for a while, because I think it's time to deliver the goods elsewhere. The objective of awareness, so to speak, has been achieved significantly in the last 5 years. It's out of the public domain. If in a student institution, in a student festival, you choose to bring up that particular issue, I think it reflects the success of the percolation of the issue to this particular level. So the idea is awareness is done. Problem on its scoping is done. So applying the oil method, you move to the solution. You start asking what are the solutions. How do you combine tradition with practicality? And how do you look at community stakeholdership and participation? And how do you also make sure that you have enough religious secular institutions, which is to say those which perform secular functions but with a very clear religious mooring. Nobody should be saying tomorrow yoga se Hindu ka koi connection nahi hai. That statement should never come out in the future. So how do you do that? Yes. Go
ahead. Sir, coming to the subject of coloniality, we see that the institutions of the modern state are a carry forward from our colonial past.
Right.
Can you suggest a methodological approach to decolonize the Indian mind in a state like this, where the juxtaposition of the nation state on the civilizational identity is yet another problem which we face?
So here's a word of compliment for you. I'm so happy that you're asking these questions in such a brilliantly framed manner, because even in law schools I haven't had such brilliant questions framed. So kudos to you. Very good. I certainly did not expect this, because the unfortunate stereotypical reality, as an engineer, please take this as someone who's coming from your own flock, so to speak, that we suck at English is the standard assumption, right? Not that it's bad. So here's the funny part. When I make this statement, people will say on the one hand you want decoloniality, on the other hand you're saying you shouldn't suck at English, right? So the answer to that is yes. You do not have the excuse for being bad at something after having gone through 16 years of education in language, period. That's it. So that's the answer to the question, which is you've been put through this entire boot camp for 16 years, and the mother tongue has been scrubbed out completely. At least be good at what has been imposed on you. It's the simple thing. That's it. Okay, nothing else. Even if you do chori, hathi safai honi chahiye, period. So, as far as the question is concerned, see, in the book I have said one or two things. I do not wish to pass myself off as an expert on everything under the sun. Therefore, I am not in a position to suggest specific initiatives as far as decolonization, and the word is not decolonization, it's decolonialization, in different streams are concerned, because that is for subject matter experts to look at. Why? Let me explain. In the realm of linguistics, I would want somebody who understands the nexus between consciousness and language to basically explain education mein iska asar aisa hua hai, right? Let them identify the problem, and then you get to the people who understand the nexus between pedagogy, language, and education, and then combine their specific and special skill sets and say this is the way forward to remove these layers. This is not, it's not an exercise in finding purity, it's an exercise in finding indigeneity. There's a difference. Okay? So the idea is, once the problem definition is put out and you say this is an all-pervasive problem, I clearly said subject matter experts must take this forward in their respective areas: national security, demographics, religion, constitution, culture, pop culture, academics and whatnot, media. So having done that, I have said I will walk the talk as far as my area is concerned by trying to speak of decolonialization or cultural decolonization in the area of law. And since the multiplier effect is typically created by a document which defines the identity of the state, namely the constitution, how do you try and structure this differently? But before that, I have to come to the conclusion that it is poorly structured in the first place. And this is not empty talk, it has to be an evidence-based approach. So I will not make a statement on the document itself, whether it's mixed or colonial or decolonial, until the trilogy is complete. Okay? I've only spoken on the colonial nature of the journey itself, but the outcome I have not yet been able to come up with. I've limited the timelines in that particular sense. Take it from me, and I say this right now before this audience, the second book will literally shape you to the core. Because the anger that it has filled me with and I'm going through the literature, the idea is to pass on that anger. That's exactly what I'm doing. And I have to transmit that anger, that is my entire goal. Which is people should know. So I don't know how many people have read Sabarimala Temple. So Sabarimala Temple, one of his very favorite personality traits is out of the Navarasas, one of them is Raudram. Raudram is typically righteous anger. It's not brutish, impotent, useless anger, but it is anger for a purpose, and anger channeled or directed in a particular direction. So that's the nature of this anger. And the terrible part of English is Raudram has a very poor equivalent in English. Anger doesn't have nothing to it. So you'll have to fill it with a suffix called righteous anger and whatnot. But Raudram is different altogether, right? So the idea is, once the second book is out, I sincerely hope that everything that you're seeing today around you across the country, you will be able to relate it to the very same tendencies of the 1900s, which led to the partition of Bharat. I leave it at that. Next.
Thank you, sir. Like, we did read your thread wherein you elaborated upon the fact that you are yet to complete the research and make a final remark on the present form of the Constitution and make a judgment on the coloniality of the document.
Right.
So we are eagerly looking forward to the next book.
Yes, sir. So the next question here is, how relevant are the physical markers in pursuit of an Indic state? And how significant is the assertion of civilizational identity compared to being a group practicing Hindus?
So split this into two questions. I mean, just the first question first. Because the first question is, again, it's bound to attract labels of fascism particularly. So, the existence of a label is the very first, or let's say a physical marker, is the very first sign of announcement of your identity. That is where it starts by way of resistance. Think of it as a passive resistance. Okay? Two, while you may be doing this initially to resist, at some stage the mind will start asking, what exactly am I doing this for? Am I doing this to flaunt an identity, or am I doing this to understand it better? So the trigger will be external, but hopefully the inquiry will be internal after a point, where you will actually start asking the right questions. I'm 100% sure a lot of people are going to tell me, look at all these possessions. Do you really think all of them are religious Hindus? Do they have an iota of faith in what they're doing? Or are they doing this to create nuisance? Are they doing this to irritate the other person? These will be the questions. Well, when my identity is constantly snubbed, stifled, and silenced and subjugated, at some point it's bound to rebound. So what's happening at this stage is this. Why do you think Bal Gangadhar effectively asked for public celebration of Ganesh Chaturthi? Why was he doing it? Because for centuries you were stopped from celebrating it in public spaces. I read it for the second book and show it. Letter by letter I'll say who said what. What kind of farmans were issued that you will not celebrate this in public. Under no circumstances will the Hindu be allowed to wear his religious identity in public. The construction of the Birla Mandir in Delhi was a monumental event because they were able to construct a temple after centuries. So never underestimate the presence, because you announce your presence by being present in public. The moment you are out from the public eye, out of mind is another, out of sight is out of mind. So it starts there. But then slowly you move inwards. And hopefully, at least that's been my journey. I'm not saying that this journey is going to be the same everywhere. Obviously, property, nature, everything is different for each person. But the hope is, then you'll ask, why am I doing this? What does it signify? What are my traditions? What are my roots? And hopefully you will go in that particular direction. And then the embracement or the adoption of the roots, or the re-adoption of the roots begin. That is the hope. That is hopefully the ideal conclusion, or the ideal culmination in the beginning of a different journey altogether. But this is where it starts. So it has two specific implications. Social, political, yes, 100% yes. It is the need of the hour. I believe that. And if you say otherwise, sure, you're entitled to your opinion, then you are certainly not living in the real world because you don't see what's happening. Second, from there the journey moves inwards. Okay? And hopefully you have, let's say, the wherewithal either personally or you have the resources around you to guide you in the particular journey. So, if this starts, then hopefully you start visiting that institution. And then you start asking the right questions. That is my trigger. Now, what is the second question?
The question was like, how significant is the assertion of civilization identity compared to just a group of Hindus practicing their dharma?
So it's twofold, as I said. So it actually ties into the first question. Assertion of civilization identity is in the realm of the public domain, whereas your practice is primarily an introspective personal journey. So when someone says religious is personal, sorry, that's not what the Constitution even says. When the Constitution recognizes the existence of religion and also its practice, where it doesn't say private or public, and it also recognizes the existence of religious institutions controlled by communities, then there are two levels at which you're operating. First is the individual, and the second is the political or the community or the communal for that matter. And communal here, I'm not using it in a negative sense, I'm saying community-based and hence communal. Now, students of engineering must understand both scale and frame of reference. It would be fundamentally stupid to apply the community scale to the individual and the individual scale to the community, both in terms of values and practice. Okay? So while practice and your relationship with the Supreme Consciousness is a personal journey, which hopefully is an evolving journey, not a regressive journey, the other end is important for you to survive as a community. So both are equally important. One need not be conflated from the other, and both aren't mutually destructive. They are important. The existence of a community and a communal organization is the very reason why you're able to practice your personal journey with the safety of those numbers and the confidence that there is someone to speak on your behalf. So, right, anything the numbers don't matter where. Kashmir, Bengal, and Kerala examples. Next.
One last question, then we'll go with the audience. So, sir, you made a very interesting comment in the earlier part of the discussion, when you said that as Bharat emerges, you expect the very nature of democratic politics to get altered.
Right.
So, we expect a general remark on democratic politics of the subcontinent and the implications which it has had on the Hindu Rensa revivalist or resistive cause. Because we've seen a movement going on in the past, like, we've been resisting since 1 millennium now.
Right.
And now we are in a socio-political arrangement which is very, very distinct from everything that was there in the past.
Right.
So how do you see this?
So there are two authors in books that I would strongly recommend reading, assuming this is an area of interest or even aptitude for the matter. First is by this Indian origin Sri Lankan author, Anand Kumar Swamy. who has written brilliantly on the nature of state institutions in ancient Bharat, or for that matter, pre-colonial Bharat, let's call it that, not ancient Bharat. Ancient puts it several thousands of years ago. And because as early as Devaraya, or for that matter, even Chhatrapati, you had these kings specifically trying to subscribe to the Indic way of Rajadharma. Okay, in fact, there's a beautiful illustration of the division or the breakup of a king's schedule in the Arthashastra. Literally, the man has to lead a breathless life, breakneck pace. They barely had about 4 to 4.5 hours of sleep, going by that. Okay. So read that to understand that you're not talking of something in a golden age, which is several thousands of years ago, and which is not practicable or practical. Then there's another set of books written by K.P. Jaiswal on Hindu political thought. Then I was recently introduced to this particular author, and I wasn't aware of either his existence or his works. Sri Devendra Suruchi, written in Hindi, and I think it's an 18-volume treatise on constitution. Okay, where he looks at it from an Indic perspective. The best part of all this, which is the bulk of it, is either it's written from a native perspective or in native language itself. So it's much more relatable in that sense. Although it's written in Hindi, I love the language and I just go gaga over it completely. So as far as the movement is concerned, we are at a suboptimal pace, and a suboptimal place according to me. This is not ideal under any circumstances. Because there is no role for an institutional, you know why Rajya Sabha was established? So Rajya Sabha was previously known as the Chamber of States. Why Chamber of States? What states are we talking about? Princely states. So you had the British ruled provinces, or British India for that matter, represented through the lower house, and the upper house effectively had the princely states, because they would make recommendations. And gradually that was replaced with nominations of intellectuals. Why is that important? Because you're saying, on the one hand you have the pleb opinion from the lower house, which is the common person's opinion. On the other hand you also have the intelligentsia supporting it. But for all practical purposes, the Rajya Sabha nomination has become an honorary position. What policy inputs are you looking at? Who attends Rajya Sabha these days? Even for the matter of so-called celebrated cricket, many people are attending it. What inputs are you looking at from their perspective? What has been their contribution? So it's become some kind of a reward for an achievement of a professional achievement. Whereas it was meant to be a place where you can draw from their experience to help the society in a different way. So the idea is to bring back those elements, perhaps in the existing structure. So as part of the book, in the first book I've said this, there are two ways of going about this. Uproot the existing system, root and branch. But it comes with the cost of transition, both economic, cultural, social and whatnot. Can you mold existing institutions in an Indic fashion and populate it with an Indic spirit, which is to say mold the body a bit, but infuse it with an Indic spirit through definitions, through policies, through thought, which is, to give a very specific example, when you choose to come out with a development policy or an environmental impact assessment plan which came out recently, which I believe is terrible, I don't believe that the government's EIA policy is particularly conducive to nature. So I've said this as much on multiple places. In fact, my teams have written articles on the subject. So when you do that, if you wanted to apply an Indic thought to that particular policy, you would ask, fine, development is important, but at what cost? How do you displace these people? And how do you rehabilitate them? Because for them, it's not a matter of just a staying space. It is a space that they've been cultivating for generations and millennia together. Their entire life systems revolve around this. You will not just change their livelihoods, but their entire way of life. Along with that comes a significant amount of let's say, impact on the environment. All these questions, how do you answer it? Now, unfortunately, the checklist that you have as part of the EIA doesn't ask too many of these questions. It looks at what? Compensation they diya. Dusra mega de diya. Baat khata. Itna answer. It's almost as if you treated this as another land acquisition act. Right? So, these are considerations which you would be forced to ask, and it will introduce Indic variables and new variables if dharma becomes a policy-making instrument as opposed to some esoteric concept hanging in the 60,000 feet. Makes no sense. You want to apply it, this is the way to apply it. Then you start asking questions about education. Is this the right education policy? Are we doing the right thing? You've secularized it so much or you've Christianized it so much that you're surprised at your own decision that it's producing self-loathing areas. What are you surprised at? What else did you expect? What else did you expect? This is such a straightforward equation machine. So it's almost as if you're expecting a radically different output when the input and the mechanism has been the same. Beats logic and common sense. So we shouldn't be surprised. Oh, hum to aise nahi the, bacche aise kaise hote? What are you talking about? You've put them to a proper mass production industry of self-loathing people. And if anybody has succeeded to come out with their filters intact, it is not because of the system, it is despite the system. Next.
So now we'll take questions from the audience. So you can raise your hand if you wish to ask a
last
question.
bencher, I've always been a last bencher, so let's start from here. I just have one request. I have these standard requests. Introduce yourself so that I understand where the question is coming from. And two, if possible, please be polite and hold your tone and content. Yes.
Hello sir, my name is Tanil Joshi and I am from Indore. And my question is, sir, how significant is retaining traditions in our society in like after 20 to 30 years?
Those societies which have not retained their traditions have now started floundering because you can't get a better example than a society like the United Kingdom, which is out on its way in terms of deracination. Parts of Europe which are deracinated, and they simply don't have the response or the answers to the new challenges that they're facing, both by way of immigration, illegal migration, and whatnot. They have zero answers to it. Technology and culture are not mutually exclusive. They need not be treated as mutually exclusive. I'll give you a fantastic example. Make one 12-day trip to Israel, just one trip to Israel. It's one of those few communities and countries that has produced the maximum number of Nobel laureates. The size of this country is less than Greater Mumbai put together. The population is 8.5 million. 40 villages in this country can outbreed Israel, or even lesser. Okay? That's the population and our capacity. Now, that country has not compromised on technology. Ask anyone in the pharmaceutical space, some of the finest inventions come from there. I practice intellectual property law, I represent Indian generic companies. I know the number of blockbuster molecules that come from the other side. Okay? And you are importing defense equipment from there. At the very least, that is a marker of their advancement as far as technology is concerned. You would agree with that. Go to that country and ask yourself if they've compromised on their Jewish identity. I've given this example at least on more than 2 occasions, that like you have the Brahmins in this country, or the practicing Brahmins in this country, and not just the genuine Hari and let's say birth Brahmins in this country, the actual practicing Brahmins in this country, the direct comparable example is the Orthodox Jewish community. And this community refuses to raise arms, which is to say it is not supposed to resort to violence. So in Israel, they have a practice of conscription for 2 years, right? This community was given a free pass and exemption for all these years, saying you need not contribute your children to this particular movement. But ultimately, other communities said, "Hamare bache thode kam bache hain." So they had to contribute. So what do? They're given specific timings to perform their rituals. You can identify these people through their flowing locks, and they wear the yarmulke and the kippah. Okay. And while cannons are being fired, you can actually find videos of them praying while this happens. Other soldiers protecting them. So if the intention is to protect tradition and also keep pace with time, ho sakta hai, niyat ki baat hai, mansha ki baat hai, disha ki baat hai, period. It's only in this country where we believe that if you need scientific temper, you're supposed to abandon religion. What scientific temper are you talking about? You've not been able to match the architecture of the past. What are you really talking about? You're building glass structures in the zone of fire in Gurgaon and Rajasthan and Chennai. What geniuses are we producing? So I am not running down this generation. I am saying if you choose to run down the past, be ready for criticism of the present also. Right? Second, so what's the traditional holiday for the Jews? Weekdays. What's a weekday hai? Saturday. What's it called? Sabbath or the Shabbat, that's the word for it. right? So if you go there, so in 2016, I happened to deliver a lecture at an Orthodox Jewish synagogue in Rochester. Most people know New York City and New York State is full of Jews, right? On New Jersey for that matter. So I was asked to deliver a lecture. I insisted on doing this in an Orthodox Jewish synagogue just to see how they conduct the entire service. I was curious about it. And I've been a keen student of Israeli history as well as Jewish history, so I wanted to see the place. And I said, whatever rules you have to follow, I will follow all those rules, except you will respect my dietary restrictions. So if you go to Israel or you go to Jewish-dominated parts of America for that matter, and they know that you are Hindu, they will ask you to learn this word to ensure that your dietary restrictions are respected. No bakal, no beef. Okay? That's what you're expected to tell them. And if you go to Israel, you'll find a lot of places which are no beef friendly. Okay? Now, when I went there, and I told them I'll follow all of this, you're not supposed to touch any electronic equipment, no laptops, in fact, no pens for that matter, you're not supposed to write. All these restrictions are there. And my lecture was supposed to be at the end of the lunch session. I watched the entire thing. Scientists, judges, lawyers, ophthalmologists, startups, entrepreneurs, VCs. What is this divide in our heads which they don't suffer from? They don't. Because you have chosen to associate your culture with lack of scientific temper, and therefore the only way you see for progress is by abandoning your roots, and that is a direct product of the 1835 minute of the genius called Thomas Babington Macaulay. That is the product. And I have extracted that minute page by page and word by word in the book, as opposed to paraphrasing it, so that I am not accused of misinterpreting. Okay? They have no such illusions in their head. None whatsoever. Next.
Hello sir, I am Chirag Shah, I am from Nagpur. My question is, what do you think constitutes a Hindu identity?
Hindu identity, first of all, is not a monolithic identity, but traditionally how it has been defined. And I will explain this with sources. First of all, there is a belief in the supreme consciousness named Brahman. Then there is a pure belief in the theory of in the law of karma, not theory, in the law of karma, and therefore obviously you believe in reincarnation or the multiple life concept. Okay, and there is a belief in what is known as the three prakritis, which is sattva, rajas, and tamas. Once and then you believe that the ultimate goal or the objective of this entire pipeline is not salvation but liberation, therefore mukti or moksha. From that fundamental thought comes your social organization. Okay? Now, what is the position of Vedas as far as this philosophy is concerned? If you believe that Vedas are the primary proof of the existence of, let's say, the deity and all these philosophies, that pramana or that authority becomes the basis of your belief system. And that becomes the Astika school of philosophy. Those who don't believe in the position of Vedas as the primary source or the primary pramana are still Hindu philosophies, but they are Nastika philosophy. Nastika doesn't mean atheism in Hindu philosophy. It simply means that which does not subscribe to Veda as the primary pramana or the primary authority. That's it. So when you say I'm Nastik, I'm atheist, that explains the direct conflation of English terminology and their understanding of atheism with Nastik, which it is not. They are not the same. Soul and Atma are not the same. Priest and Purohit are not the same. God and Devatas are not the same. And therefore Nastik and atheist are not the same. So the definition of a Hindu, because you don't have one central book, is primarily based on a fundamental belief in these basic philosophies, followed by your Sampradayic identities. You could come from Vaishnava Sampradaya, you could come from the Tantra, you could come from Advaita. So one basic substratum coupled with your Sampradayic identities. And Sampradaya ka matlab negative nahi hai, communal nahi hai, matlab something that is related to a Sampradaya or a tradition or a denomination for that matter. सो हिंदू आइडेंटिटी ऐसे हो गई, बिकॉज आपका कोई एक पुस्तक नहीं है, किताब नहीं, पुस्तक एक पुस्तक नहीं है. Therefore, you are entitled to choose. Now, the problem is, therefore, what we end up saying is, there is nothing fixed in Hinduism. No, you are not. The difference is, as opposed to one basket, you may have 108 baskets. You get to choose from each of these. But हर basket का अपना एक rule होता है. सभी baskets के एक rule नहीं है, हर basket का अपना एक rule होता है. इसका मतलब नहीं है कि rule है ही नहीं. Understood? So you have a multiplicity of options to choose from, and thereby you have a greater freedom and greater plurality from a theological perspective, so that you can choose what is more proximal and relatable to your nature. I don't think I can subscribe to this because इनके rules मुझसे follow नहीं होते. तो देखो क्या follow होता है. ठीक है, आपके पास और एक ऑप्शन हो सकता है, which is to say मैं मिक्स करके करूँगा, खिचड़ी पकाऊंगा, कर लो, कोई बात नहीं. बट डिफरेंस इज, आप अपनी खिचड़ी को संप्रदाय पर नहीं थोपेंगे. which is to say, your personal practice which you have decided to make it into a mishriff thing, or a mixture, you will not treat that as the benchmark to say, no, my sampradaya must also follow this. You will not impose your personal beliefs there because they have been doing this for generations. So what is the way out? तो होता क्या है? So assume for a moment, आपको लगता है मुझे 108 मुझे 109 करना है. I want to start something. Then you show the proof of concept, like you do it in, let's say, the startup world, by inspiring followers to your cause and setting up a new denomination. You will not go and say, तुम बदलो, अरे तुम्हें बदलना है, तुम बदलो और अपना खुद का सेटअप करो. No, nobody is going to stop you. फतवे जारी नहीं होंगे, सर तो गलत नहीं होगा, ठीक है? अब शुरू करो, कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है. बट आप जाके यहाँ पे थोपेंगे नहीं. So the philosophy is, nobody says we should do only 108. Take it 109, 110. Go ahead, do it. You are nobody to go and change that institution. You show that you are in a position to inspire confidence by living as an example and setting up a new institution. That's exactly how each of these sampradayas have come out. Someone who says, sorry, I don't think that Vedas are the primary pramana, will start a Shramana school, or will start a, let's say, Buddhist school. Or he will start something else for that matter. Let's say, I don't know how many people are from Kerala here, but there's a legend, Narayan Guru for that matter, from the Irva community, who basically said, so on the one hand you had Periyar's movement and you had the Ambedkarite movement and then you had this. Each of them saying, Brahmanavat ko thodo, Jativat ko thodo, sab kuch thodo. Narayan Guru went the other way. He basically said, if you think he is sitting at the top, aspire to climb the ladder. Why should he alone be at the top? And therefore he started something called as what I would call positive competition. Which is to say, do you want to pull down the structure or do you want to rise up to the structure and create your own universe? That philosophy brilliantly helped the community. And today they are among the most educated, politically aware and very conscious Hindus. As opposed to other movements which pulled people away from Hinduism. Because the in question is, आप इस ढांचे को और मजबूत करना चाहते हैं या उसको गिराना चाहते हैं. मजबूत करने के बहुत सारे तरीके हैं. गिराने का सिर्फ एक तरीका है, kick. So when you look at भारतीय धार्मिक, socio-political, religious movements, try and apply this lens. मैं इसको आपके थोप नहीं रहा हूँ, it's just a suggestion. That will help you understand better. Why is it that we have moved apart when we could have come closer without giving up our diversity of thought? This is the only land where this kind of diversity is possible without people literally beheading each other at the drop of a hat. Next. Why is the atmosphere so serious, or am I making it serious? एक कान से कह रहा हूँ, please mic use करो. It's not working, so shout. Be louder. Be louder.
Hello sir, my name is Rashish.
Yes.
My question to you is, what we as students can take steps to bring a change in the Indic Renaissance?
Okay. So I'm happy that at least you accept the premise of the Renaissance and you're okay with it. So I'll tell you what you shouldn't do and then I'll say what you should be doing. Since you're allowing me to take this turn, I'm giving these prescriptions. Others will take this as suggestions. Standard mistake that everybody makes is to ask, how do I become like him or a lawyer or something? I don't see how it works. Either you make a career transition, and हर आदमी को तो वकील बनना भी नहीं चाहिए किसी भी हाल में, because the society I think is terrible if it has too many lawyers, and it's an unhealthy place to live. And then the question is, what can you do given your skill sets, and whether you have the ability and the interest to expand your skill sets, या उसी कंफर्ट जोन में रह के करना है, ये सवाल पहले कर लेना चाहिए, या प्रश्न पहले कर लेना चाहिए. So what do you do then? If you want to remain an engineer, one first suggestion: don't settle in the US. This land needs you. I'm being very, very honest here, and it's a request. Don't leave this country. And even if you do come back, it's unimaginable to think, firstly, from a personal perspective. What is the purpose of all this? You leave your parents and go and what, celebrate festivals. Now, you ask them, "What है? वो क्या है? I don't understand. What kind of a divided existence is this?" But should you choose to go there, assimilate, give up everything, become part of that society? This hypocrisy I don't understand. I understand the value of a diaspora, but I don't understand the value of a population whose entire existence is in creating the diaspora. The purpose of Indians is not to produce people outside. The purpose of the education institutions is not to export people. And I'm not saying this from the standard, done to death, brain drain argument. Demographics, I want people here. Go to a lot of these localities, whether it's in Hyderabad or Bangalore and other places, you see only old people living there, parents living there, others are not here. So first thing, go to any other country, but use that country to equip yourself and come back to Bharat. Don't let them use you. You're anyway the cash cow. निचोड़ रहे हैं आपको. खत्म करो वापस. And I say this with a lot of responsibility. I'm not making a jingoistic statement here. If you want to be part of the most exciting territory for the next 50 or 100 years, Asia, China, China's time has come and it will come. Apna time aayega, thoda time aayega. We're not there yet. But it will be only after China, not before. You're not ready, you're not prepared as much. You may hate them, whatever it is, but they're significantly invested in this particular direction. And whether you like someone or not, investment का एक reward होता है, and they have a right to benefit from that. Okay? You have not invested, that's your problem, and that's your folly. They clarified the identity, realized the stupidity called communism is atrocious, killed billions, and they said, "ये नहीं होगा भाई, खाना तो नहीं मिलेगा इसे. We'll have to eat rabbits like Venezuela." They killed sparrows. Sparrows did not exist in China for 7 years, thanks to all their multiple revolutions. So they decided to rebrand communism altogether. अब मान तो नहीं सकते कि हमने गलती किया, क्योंकि कम्युनिस्ट दिमाग है, कभी मानेगा नहीं, right? So they said, नहीं, अब ये Chinese communism with Chinese characteristics, slowly it's becoming capitalism with Chinese characteristics and democracy with Chinese characteristics. That's the way they made the U-turn. So for all their mistakes, they will benefit from the investment, from the strategic investment. They will continue to make mistakes because they've played their hand a bit too early, but they will certainly benefit from it because the larger society is much more aware and conscious than the Indian society. Okay? You may think they don't have freedoms. You should simply see their ability to compete. Or for that matter, their pride in the Chinese attitude. Unbeatable. So, first suggestion is, come back. If at all you are interested in going. Strengthen Bharat using your primary skill sets. How is it that someone else is able to extract something from the very same thing? So obviously, demand में तो कोई problem नहीं. Then it's a question of the system. I think after a lot of investment, this is an exciting startup generation for Bharat. As someone who has worked with people in the NITI Aayog and the startup industry, as an argument counselor, of course, I don't advise and all that, but a lot of friends from the industry, the sheer amount of VC investment that's happening in the startup sector in Bharat is astounding. So you have the option of creating all of this. So stay. Second, from an individual perspective, which is to say, practicing Hindu perspective. Start with the visual symbol that he referred to, okay? And maybe try and read up a bit more, because anyway you're reading nonsense. You might have to replace the content. You're anyway going to read stuff, right? Whether it is useful or not is the only question. So, social media will force you to consume capsule information, killing your ability to retain stuff as well as your goals. This generation will turn out to be the generation, unfortunately so, with perhaps the poorest possible memory. That's a huge faculty completely going down the drain. Start reading, increases your attention span and your ability to connect the dots. 3 is perhaps, as opposed to a system being imposed on you, earmark 10 to 15% of your earnings towards a cause which is Hindu in nature. Very clearly I'm saying that. Don't just say education, don't just say insaniyat and humanity. Hindu, period. If you don't have the ability to think clearly on these lines, then you're investing in creating a grave for you. Because अगर convert हो गए तो जरा भी नहीं हिलेंगे ना. उसके बाद really very, you know. So I'm saying you're literally investing in a grave. So don't do that. Invest in your people. I am saying this. If it's parochial, so be it. If it's narrow-minded, so be it. This is what I have to say. Invest in your people first. But when you say your people, don't limit yourself to your job. Shouldn't make a difference. For me, it starts and ends with an embed. And finally, take an active interest in the administration of your religious institutions. Don't leave it just to the state or to the core actors. Start building a relationship. I think these are doables where you don't need state support. None of these suggestions require the resources from any other person. It's entirely free. But assuming for a moment you're willing to step outside your comfort zone, which is engineering, assuming that engineering is first of all your comfort zone, it's a huge premise. Assuming that you wish to step out, then qualify yourself in strategic issues. I would have never spoken on the law of civilization unless I had qualified myself as at least a lawyer. And I can speak on some of these subjects because as part of my legal training, political science, economics, and history, we are expected to understand. At the very least, we are expected to be comfortable with it. So, if you wish to step out of that, then we need people on the strategic front heavily with serious analytical skills, not just opinionated nonsense. People who can present data, use data to come out with a narrative. Yes.
Actually, I'm very excited to meet you. Namaskar, sir. I'm Chirag J, from Indian from the city of Madhya. So my question is, like, we talk about freedom of expression in our country. So we have seen people, making insults on our religion and on our culture. But on the other hand, they don't do same to other communities or other things. So my question is, should it be allowed? Should we allow them to do so? Because it should be equally, right? So should we allow them, or should we impose some penalty? So not like the other religions, but we are seeing that the people are being captured into the jails. So do you think it would have a negative impact, or should it will stop that from happening?
How many of you want me to answer this question? Consequences against that. So, जब भी प्रेडेटर और प्रे को इक्वल ट्रीटमेंट दिया जाएगा, वो हमेशा इनइक्वालिटी में ही रिजल्ट होगा. उसका नतीजा सिर्फ इनइक्वालिटी हो सकता है. फंडामेंटली अगर सोच में इक्वालिटी नहीं है तो काहे का इक्वालिटी? क्या बात कर रहा है? Someone has the ability to pass a smoke at the law and also issue street veto without 2 foots given to the law. आप उस पर और कानून थोपेंगे, क्या हो जाएगा? अरे एग्जिस्टिंग कानून उसको कुछ नहीं कर पा रहे हैं और कानून डालेंगे. It's like Biden suggesting sanctions for Russia. What nonsense? क्या कर रहे हैं? I can take this entire land और क्या करोगे? 25 और sanction कर लोगे. That's the price I have to pay to get this entire piece of land. Fantastic. So what law? The answer lies in the realm of society. Remember one thing. आपके खिलाफ कोई बात कर पा रहा है इसलिए क्योंकि आपके अंदर के लोग सबसे पहले बात कर रहे हैं. आपके अंदर के लोग थोड़ा बात करना कम करें इन विषयों पे, और ये टिप्पणी और व्यंग के वाण चलाना भी बंद करें, तब देखते हैं कि कौन बार बार बात करें। Savarkar said, and I have quote 18 criticisms. Your adversary is the secular idiot Hindu.
So guys, we understand that all of you have a lot of questions, but unfortunately due to time constraints, we have to end the session here. So we'll present a memento to sir.
Sure.